think we're ready to go. So welcome to Brown Bag History for March 17th, 2021. Happy St. Patrick's Day too. Today's topic is farming, and as we start, we will acknowledge the land, traditions, and culture of four nations, the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Okanagan Nation Alliance. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. And while the Indigenous people in this area weren't farmers in the traditional sense, they certainly were hunters and gatherers, and they knew the land very well, and they knew how to manage the land very well. So it's important to acknowledge that when we're talking about farming in the area. When I first moved here in 1978, I never thought of Revelstoke as a farming area, and people didn't really think of this as an agricultural area as well. There's high mountains here. There's not a lot of valley land, at least there isn't now. That's another part of the story. But there was a lot of farming going on here, and I've got 17 pages of notes today and over 60 slides. And I'm really just scratching the surface, pun intended. It's a big topic. There was a lot of farming going on here. I'm mentioning some farm names, but there was a lot of people who were farming that aren't mentioned in this talk. But we do have a lot more information in the archives than what we'll see today. One of the very first farms in the area was that of the Fraser family. And Fred Fraser came here in 1885 working for the railway, and his wife joined him here. And they purchased land in what's now the Big Eddy area. And in this photograph, you can actually see the ties of the railway bridge. So they were just across the railway bridge on the Big Eddy side. This was their farmhouse that they built in the 1890s. And if you look around, this is in the winter, so it was obviously no crops in. There's a lot of trees there, and there's a lot of stumps. So anybody who was farming in the area had a heck of a lot of work to do to clear the land. This was the Fraser family in the 1890s with 4 of their 9 children. Their first daughter was born in Ontario. Mrs. Fraser went back east to have her first child, but her second child, Florence, the one sitting in the chair on the right, was noted as the first Caucasian child born in all of West Kootenay in 1887. So they were definitely one of the early families to settle here. By 1909, they'd moved to the industrial park area. They had dairy cows, chickens, and vegetable crops. There's one little newspaper note I came across in the 1890s where Fred Fraser was walking home to his property, and he saw one of his cows there, and all of a sudden a bear appeared in front of him, and the cow came and chased the bear away. So that cow was considered to be pretty important and special to the Fraser family. Another of the early families in the Big Eddy was the Griffiths. They settled in Big Eddy in 1908, and there was a few other families that had settled there by then. They were actually able to get a hold of the old Northwest Mounted Police building at the top of Douglas Street Hill and move it over to their farm property. They were, there's a quote from Mrs. Griffiths, Alice Griffiths. She said, "Our acreage was beginning to look like a farm. Tom bought a team of horses, a cow, and chickens. We had a very productive garden. The soil of the creek bed, which lay behind the house, produced fine vegetables such as celery, spinach, etc., etc. And they were, excuse me, they were farming right close to where the Tum Tum or Tonkawa comes into the Columbia. The Revelstoke had a farmers institute, and Tom Griffith was a member of that. And in the early days, the BC Agricultural Department was quite active in supporting farms in the region and throughout the province. And they set up Dominion experimental stations in different parts of the province. And for 15 years, the Tom Griffith Farm was the local Dominion experimental station. And that's where they would come and they would have courses for the farmers. They would try experimental crops and help the farmers out in various ways. The Griffith Farm produced prize-winning potatoes, carrots, turnips, and various other tested vegetables. During the summers, they would have a field day held to inspect the results of the harvest, and the agriculturalists would come from across Canada and give talks and presentations, and the local farmers would come to the experimental farm to get seeds and crops and learn new techniques as well. Another of the Big Eddy farmers was Reverend William Calder, who came here in the 1890s as the Presbyterian minister, came out from Nova Scotia. You can see they had a big family. He acquired a homestead grant in the Big Eddy area, and also, again, this is close to the Tum Tum. You can actually see the creek behind him, or it was also known as Tonka Creek, and he called his farm Tonka Farm. He had 63 acres. There was a note from the newspaper in September 1915 saying that a year previously he'd purchased a herd of Ayrshire cows. Calder said that Ayrshire milk is not as heavy as Jersey, but he considered it superior for family purposes, especially for delicate people and infants. Said that the Ayrshire was also more easily fed than other breeds and was a good beef cow as well. At that time, he had, in 1915, he had 12 registered cows, 10 heifers, and 2 young bulls. He also had charge of an Ayrshire bull that had been sent into the district by the Dominion government for breeding purposes. And he also had a pair of Berkshire pigs and other young pigs. He built the first silo in the Revelstoke district. He applied to the provincial government through the Revelstoke Farmers Institute to build the silo under the supervision of the Department of Agriculture. And that was in the early 1920s. And the logs were cut and hauled to town to be cut by the Sawyer Brothers Mill. And they had a government silo constructor come out to supervise the construction. It had a cement base, 13 feet diameter. The silo was 30 feet high with an inside diameter of 12 feet and a capacity of 68 tons. The government was going to send in a 6 horsepower gasoline engine and blower. And the ensilage feed would produce from 15 to 20% more milk than hay feed. And it was expected to give a estimated savings of $600 on the feed bill from the previous year. Another picture of the big barn on the Calder farm and the farmhouse. This is a picture taken in 1960. And showing a little rickety bridge over the little creek there, backwater, and the house. I think that was also taken around 1960. You can see this in this photograph, probably taken in the 1940s, 30s, or 40s. You can see there's not a lot of built up in Big Eddy. It was very much agricultural land, mostly at that time. There were other farms there. Dan McIntosh was one of the farmers that took up a homestead in 1906 and lived there until 1947. The Nelson family, Elias Nelson and his wife Ida, and their family came to the Big Eddy around 1913 from Norway. There were other families from Sweden and Norway who settled in the Big Eddy as well. So quite a few of the Scandinavian farm settlers were farming there. This is Elise and Nels Nelson. Of course, Nels was our famous ski jumper. So there was quite a bit of farm activity taking place there in that area. And in the 1940s, after the uh, Japanese population was forcefully evicted from the West Coast, a lot of them were in camps, but there were several families who were able to settle outside of city limits because the government, the city council would not allow Japanese people to settle within the city limits. But Big Eddy was outside of the city at that time. And in fact, anything south of Downey Street was outside of the city limits at that time. So there were a few Japanese families who settled in the Big Eddy as well and established farms there too. So Columbia Park was actually named after park land that was set aside for the city or for the community in the 1890s. But you can actually see Big Eddy in this picture as well as a section of Columbia Park. And this was taken in the probably early 1960 or so when they were, you can see that the Columbia River Highway Bridge is under construction in this photograph. But you can see all around there's farmland. So Columbia Park was almost entirely farmland in the very early days as well. You can see where Woodenhead Park and the A&W is there. That was the farm of the Boyd McMahon family. You can see these farms all throughout there. One of the early settlers in the area was Job Maley and his wife, Edith. They purchased land which was previously George Laforme's farm in 1898. And that's close to where the Baptist church is now, sort of around that area. And they converted it into a market garden. Job Maley was trained as a florist, so he did specialize in flowers. He had floral greenhouses and also did vegetable gardens and an orchard as well. There's a note from the Kootenai Mail newspaper from July 11th, 1902, where the editor had a visit to Job Maley's home. He said that the crop of strawberries was one of the best to be seen. 6.5 crates were taken for the market this week. So this is 1902, and strawberries were just becoming one of the major crops in Revelstoke. And not a lot of people know that, but Revelstoke actually was one of the major strawberry producers for quite some time. And so there were a lot of the farms in Columbia Park and in some of the other areas of town, I'll talk about that a bit later, were producing strawberries. City also had, in 1902, had good crops of onions, potatoes, corn, tomatoes, vegetable marrow, squash, celery, and cabbage. He had early tomatoes in his being ripened in his hothouse in July, red pepper and cucumber. And the newspaper also said that Maley has proven that apples can be successfully grown in Revelstoke. 2 trees in his garden being laden with fruit. You can see this photograph here of actually that's not apples. That looks more like cherries there. But he did have apple trees as well. I think we do have another picture of showing a fully laden apple tree. So he did have fruit orchards as well. In 1905, the newspaper said, at J. Maley's orchard, the fruit crop is immense. And the fruit is hanging densely from the branches, which are propped up on all sides to sustain the load. And it mentioned at that time that there were other farms in the area with large apple crops. Peterson's, Steed's, Field, McMahon, Lawson, Smythe, Needham, and Fred Fraser. In 1905, they were saying fruit has made the high values of lands in the Okanagan Valley, selling for from $100 to $300 an acre, and Revelstoke can give as good an account of itself. Now, of course, Revelstoke didn't do as well in the soft fruits like peaches and apricots. We don't have the heat for it here, but certainly there was apples and pears and cherries did well here. Smythe operated his greenhouses there for quite a few years, and then he moved onto First Street West and continued to operate there as well. The Smythe family, Hugh Smythe, had a farm just close to the junction of the Trans-Canada Highway, not far, close to where the Chevron station is now. And they farmed there for several years and raised their family out there. The girl in front of the hay cart there is Marjorie Smythe, who became Marjorie Kelly and then Marjorie Parker, who was well known in the community for many years, and had a large family of children with Mr. Kelly, and they were certainly a very well known family in town for a long time. There's a picture of their farm around 1900. The Stevenson family, Joseph and his wife had a poultry farm, and this would be close to where the turnoff is off of LaForme Boulevard to go towards the school, sort of in that area. So you can see they had quite a large farm operation at the time. This picture was taken around 1950. And Pete Peterson, who came here in the 1880s, he had a little community hall that he built on Front Street, and then he moved it onto Columbia Park, into Columbia Park. And this is sort of the road that turns off of LaForme, just going towards the golf club. And the house is still there. It's owned by his great niece. But he had a farm there. This photograph is kind of funny because he's written actually a little caption on the front of the photograph, and it said, "These trees were short-lived. They were sacrificed as feed for the farmers, for neighbors' poor animals. No law in the province to protect shade trees on roads." So he's kind of lamenting the loss of his trees there. But he did farm there for quite a few years. And a lot of the farmers in that area were growing strawberries, and they had fruit crops as well as general vegetable crops. The Upper family, Reg and Selma Upper, this is their really lovely house in Columbia Park in around 1915. And they had a farm as well. We recently acquired a copy of this photograph showing them herding cattle on the Upper farm. That's Mr. Upper is in a cart sort of behind the cows on the left side, and one of their sons on a horse just at the right of the photograph. So I was quite happy to see that photograph. We don't have a lot of cattle photos in our collection, so especially in the Columbia Park area. So we're certainly happy to get that one. Jock Malcolm was another of the farmers in the Columbia Park area, and this land is now part of the golf course. But that's just a few of the farmers who were there. There were others as well. So it was certainly a lot of crops going on there. And as I say, strawberries were one of the major crops in this whole area. So we're kind of looking now, this is a photograph taken from Mount Revelstoke National Park, looking down over the community before the trees grew up so much. And you can see just beyond the man who's sitting on the left there, sort of behind him, you can see where the old road went down south, and the railway crossing and crossed the Silhouette about where the Mark Kingsbury Bridge is now. And then you can also see that land sort of pretty much in the middle of the photograph out into the river. That was where the McKinnon property was. So there was a lot of farming going on in that area. And The other side of 4th Street, sort of across, well, where the roundabout is now, that side, that was known as Little Italy. There were a lot of farms in that area. A lot of the Italian families had settled there, and most of them had chickens and cows and vegetable gardens. You can, when you go on 4th Street, the other side of the roundabout, you can see that the houses are built really close to the sidewalk, and that was to allow as much property as possible in the back for farms, gardens, and animals. So this is a photograph taken showing the south track and part of the south side area. So you can see that there weren't too many houses there, and there was a lot of land, a lot of families who were farming there. We had families like the Cancellaries and the Fiocos and a lot of the other early Italian families that were farming there. This photograph is taken from Arrow Heights, looking down, and you can see the 4th Street bridge crossing the yellow silhouette in this photograph. And you can see in that area as well that there's a lot of open land. So there was quite a bit of farming going on there. One of the farmers in that area was Alf Brower, and he was there in the early 1900s and established quite a big poultry farm. And his farmhouse is still there. It's on the corner of 4th and Moss, a big white house. And Moss Street didn't go through on that side yet. It only went through on the other side down towards 8th. But Brower owned all of that land and had a big poultry farm there. It includes what is the trailer park in behind that area as well. That was part of his land as well. Most of Moss Street. There were other families in there as well. Those Dutchmans and other families farming there. The Growers, there was a note in the newspaper in 1921 saying that their hen house burned down, killing more than 100 of their chickens. They managed to save another 100 of their chickens and 3 of their cows. Mr. and Mrs. Grower were away at the theater when the fire started, but their son Peter was home, and he enlisted the help of the neighbors, and they were able to save at least some of their poultry and their cows. But they farmed there into the 50s anyway. Near where the skateboard park is now was the Kovac farm. There's Melnick's farming in there, and quite a few other families. You can see just to the right of the photograph that I think that was where the McKinnon farm was, below where Downey Street Sawmills is now. So there's a lot of farm operations going on in the area. This was an orchard in the south side region, the Pottruff Orchard. Not sure of the exact location of it. This photograph was taken by the photographic studio of George Stocks in the 1940s. So the McKinnon's dairy farm was one of a couple of really big dairy operations that was located here. The McKinnon family was farming there in the early 1900s. Hector McKinnon and his wife Delia started the farm. And Hector McKinnon was also mayor of Revelstoke for quite a few terms, and he also owned the McKinnon's Pool Hall, where the Explorer Society bed and breakfast or hotel is now, on 1st Street West. And so you can see they had quite a big operation there. There was a note, it was cited in the newspaper quite often as being one of the major dairies in the region. And that you can see that they've had 3 big barns and several people working for them as well. So it's quite a big dairy operation. There's the oldest son, Archie McKinnon, and his horse at the farm. Sadly, Hector McKinnon, the father and owner of the farm, died in 1929 during a fire on a neighboring farm. He was stacking hay in the barn when a flame swept over the entrance. He was pulled from the fire and taken to hospital, but he succumbed to his burns. He'd been using the barn on that farm as well. So he left his wife, Delia, with 4 children, and they continued to run the farm. This was a flood on the farm in 1928. Flood was definitely an issue for a lot of the farmers in the lower valley areas. They found this interesting note in the newspaper in January 22nd, 1932, that Everard Clark, manager of the Vernon Creamery Association, visited Revelstoke. He came to McKinnon's dairy farm and stated that it was one of the finest dairy barns in BC. But according to the newspaper, it said he advised Mrs. McKinnon to feed her large herd a regular meat ration. Norman S. Clark of Didsbury, Alberta, is the first dairy farmer in the world to feed his cows a regular meat ration. The idea was that they would reduce production costs of butterfat. Now that there are several farmers in the Okanagan feeding their cows meat. Everyone has experienced an increase in fat production and a decrease in costs. That was 1932, so that's interesting to note that, of course, a lot of farmers are now going away from meat-fed and going back to grass-fed cattle. So the McKinnon farm was one of the farms that was affected by the flooding of the valley, the raising of the Arrow Lakes Reservoir when the Sunnyside Dam was constructed in the 1960s. So the dam was formally opened in 1969, but before then people were having to move out because the flooding was immediate once the dam was completed, and it raised the reservoir, raised the Arrow Lakes Reservoir from the original Arrow Lakes, which was at Arrowhead, all the way up to Revelstoke, and it affected quite a bit of land right in the community, some of the land that was close to the river. So the McKinnons were actually able to move their house and at least one of their barns up to their property on Nickel Road, and the house is there now, and one of the barns is there as well. You can see it was a bit of a procedure. They probably wouldn't get permission to do this sort of thing now, but they drove it across the Illecillewaet River. You can see the tractor pulling the house across, but they managed to get it there. And as I say, did the same with the barn too. Charlie Singh was a really well-known market gardener in town and really beloved by the people of town. He would be seen daily going around on his vegetable cart, delivering vegetables to people in town. Usually had a pocket full of candy for the kids and also a beetroot to rub into their cheeks in case he caught them stealing, to let their moms know that they'd been stealing vegetables from him. But he had a really prolific garden, close to where the BC Hydro office is now, in the industry, just at the bottom of the industrial park area. And as I say, would deliver vegetables daily until he died in the 1950s. The Arrow Heights area, people started to farm there in the 1890s. People were finding land there and establishing farms there. The Kootenai Mail newspaper did quite a long piece in their July 26, 1901 issue called The Ranches, an interesting tour. And they went around to a lot of the larger farms in town and did a little profile on them. One of the farms that they talked about was the Moran Farm. And this hill, which is now the hill up to Arrow Heights, Airport Way, was originally known as Moran's Hill. And Moran's farm was at the base of the hill. just on this side of the bridge, probably in the area where the Alliance Church is now, and all through that area. And he had 25 acres there, and a poultry farm. That he was starting with turkeys, but he was having a problem with hawks who were picking off his young birds. But that his family stayed there for quite a few years and farmed in that region. At the top of the hill, this is Airport Way, and just beyond Nickel Road was the Alonso Farm, and the Mr. and Mrs. Alonso, Joseph and Conchetta Alonso, settled there in around probably just before 1900, 1899, in that era, and established quite a large farm as well. You can see the A-frame barn, which was a fixture in Revelstoke for many years. It was built in a barn raising party by the neighbors in around 1916. And there's another photograph by Estelle Dickey of the famous A-frame barn. And Mrs. Conchetta Alonso on the farm with probably one of her granddaughters and their flock of chickens. In 1901, when this article was written, there was a family named the Hay family, Henry and his wife Mary Ellen, and their children, and they had a farm that at this time was called Farm Revelstoke, but later known as Willow Creek Farm. And it was, well, Hay Road. So Hay Road is not named after the crop. It's named after the Hay family. And they had quite a large farm operation there. They moved there in 1894. They had their first home on First and Mackenzie, where the CIBC is now. And in 1904, they moved up there. Said there was no bridge over at Moran's Hill or at Arrow Heights Road or Airport Way. So the newspaper said they wended their slow way with household goods and children over the rough South Road, around the loop, passing the farms of Mr. Julian, Harry Ramsey, Sam Kroll, and Mr. Williamson, then west and north to their homestead, almost a day's journey. They had 160 acres of land, but just 8 acres cleared and cultivated by 1901. They were growing gooseberries, currants, and strawberries. They also had fruit trees and clover and hay. Mr. Hay was draining the back portion of the farm, which was very wet and swampy. They had a stable 22 feet by 80 feet with a hayloft above. And Mr. Hay was planning on going into poultry as well. They had a 1/4 acre in strawberries, with a new patch of 1/2 acre to be planted that year. Samuel Kroll was also one of the early farmers in the region. He applied for land south of Revelstoke in 1887. And this area is approximately where the airport is now. He was supplying the local hotels with produce. In 1901, he had 800 acres. And here's how it was described in the newspapers. It is a magnificent piece of land, mostly low-lying, with underground irrigation and well supplied with water. House and outbuildings, 3-stall stable, with a hayloft overhead with a capacity of 5 tons, a shed for storing vehicles and implements, 2 cellars with hay lofts overhead, one of these cellars being 36 feet in length by 15 feet in width, and the loft over the cellar holding 10 tons of hay. The Kroll farm was producing potatoes, small fruits, vegetables, including cauliflower, string beans, cabbage, carrots, onions, pumpkins, turnips, rhubarb, beets, parsnips, and celery, and hay. And in the winter, he was cutting and selling firewood in the city. He also was, in 1901, it had mentioned that his potato crop had been injured by an early frost or a late frost in July, and said that he'd never before seen frost that late in the spring. He did have a hotbed as well for starting his seeds in the spring. Said from the strawberry patches, as much as 6 crates a day were being shipped into the city, as C.B. Humes had purchased all of the season's crops. He also had a gooseberry crop and was starting apple and plum trees. He had 35 acres of farm cleared and was clearing more every season. 30 acres were in Timothy hay. He was employing 12 to 2 to up to 12 men at the time, and he had his own homemade hay press. So in 1920, the first airplane ever to land in Revelstoke landed on the Kroll farm, and it was clearly the obvious site for landing. It was a nice low-lying area, a little more open valley than a lot of the rest of the community. So that became the airport land. And of course, when the dam was built, they had to raise the land for the airport and rebuild it. There was another farm known as the Fedora Farm, which was owned by Mr. Ramsey. It was next to the Kroll farm. This is a little map from the C.B. Hume collection showing Williamson's Lake and the creeks that were flowing into it. And Ramsey Creek is at the bottom of that. So that area below at the far end of Williamson's Lake is where the Ramsey farm was. They'd been there since 1891. They had 160 acres and homestead and cultivated land occupying the basin of the creek, which formed the outlet of the lake. They had 10 acres cleared and cultivated for Timothy hay, potatoes, strawberries, and other vegetables. And their specialty was rhubarb, and it was described as one of the best crops to be seen. It later became the Bailey Farm. Bill and Mary Bailey acquired the property in 1936. He purchased the land for $1,500, and he purchased these 2 Clydesdale horses for $1,600. And they farmed there for quite a few years. A few photographs we acquired. That's their son with his one of the calves, and haying on the farm. The Williamson Farm is where we get the name of our everybody's favorite lake, the Williamson's Lake. It adjoined the Ramsey Farm. It took up a section of 160 acres. It was originally called the Lone Pine Farm after a solitary lofty pine that grew in the center. Williamson had originally worked at the CPR shops and then took up land there. The newspaper in 1901 said, "Where once stood a dense forest, he has carved out a nice home and has now over 12 acres under cultivation, including 1 acre of strawberries. So the stream flows over the property adjacent to the home, and water for irrigation comes from it. Several fruit trees were planted, but weren't bearing much yet." He had previously carried out, a dairy head with 11 head of cattle, and poultry as well, and up to 30 head of hogs. In 1906, he sold 80 acres to C.B. Hume, who had the general store in town, and Hume had crops planted there for, this is, I believe, apple trees. So he was growing produce for his own store, and they had the strawberry crop as well. He later leased the land to gardeners, Chinese market gardeners, who were producing the crops for his store. There was another little ranch on the other side of Williamson's Lake. Just go back to this slide here. Oh, farther back than I thought. Or Yates Creek. So that's the creek that comes in from the other side of Williamson's Lake across from the swimming area. And it was named after, he called it the White Rock Ranch, after what we call the Big Rock at Williamson's Lake. Yates was described in this 1901 article as being a very interesting man who has seen much more of the ups and downs of life than fall to most men. Said he took his turn among the cowboys of the wild and woolly West before the Northern Pacific Railway opened the country. He lost a fortune growing pineapples in Florida. He spent a term at the Agricultural College in Guelph, Ontario. He was a member of the Cape Rifles during the Boer War and was living in Vancouver when it was still largely forest. And said after all these ups and downs, he has sought a quiet, retired life amid the foothills near Revelstoke, where 4 years ago he took up the White Rock Ranch. He was trying bee culture, but was having trouble keeping the bees alive over winter. That he tried packing them in sawdust, but the moisture was fatal to them. He was going to try storing them in hives in a dry cellar with regulating ventilators. He was also planning on trout culture. Said it would take him about 4 years before he could get ponds and hatching houses prepared and stocked. And I'm not sure whether that ever happened. He was growing potatoes and said they were clean and free from scab. He treated the seed with corrosive sultamate, which destroys fungoids. He had early potatoes and then cabbage and celery in the same ground. He was experimenting with 7 or 8 different varieties of potatoes. He also was growing telephone peas, onions. He had Plymouth Rock chickens and Preston wheat from the government experimental farm, and again, strawberries. Said he brought in the largest berries in the district that season at sale at Bourne Brothers store. He also had raspberries and gooseberries and sugar beet. So an interesting character by the sounds of it. And his farm was a total of 160 acres. Some of the other farmers in the area were the Sirianni family, who had 160 acres east of the Hay Farm. And they took up their property about 7 years previous and had 14 acres cleared, and 2 acres of potatoes, 2 acres of oats, and half an acre of strawberries. So the area south of Revelstoke, at the base of Mount Cartier, was known as the Mount Cartier community, and it was largely settled by Ukrainian settlers in the early 1900s. The first settlers from the Ukraine came around 1907, 1908. Some of the early settlers were Steve Kochiski, Damian Hewlett, and his son Rolly, who later changed his surname to Hold, became known as Rolly Hold, Casimir Sitnik, Michael Linnick, the Ozero family, the Chikulas, Koshmans, Prohitkos, Muka, Kozaks, and quite a few others. A lot of them were from the same region in Ukraine, and they were letting each other know that there was land available here. And at that time, you could get a homestead grant for not a lot of money. So a lot of the people were settling there, and all of them established farms. A lot of them were between 20 to 40 acres, some even larger than that. Not all in cultivation, but a lot of them they were sort of subsistence plus farms, I guess is what you could call it. They were able to grow crops for themselves and enough for a little bit of sales, but they weren't able to make a living at farming. So most of the men worked off of the farms, either for the Ministry of Highways or for in logging and mills and for the railway. And the wives and children were doing a lot of the farm work. But it was a big, vibrant community. They had their own church, their own school, cemetery, post office. So it was and celebrated their Ukrainian culture there. In this photograph, just at the right of the photograph, if you look, they're not far from the river. You can see a little white building. That was their church. They did definitely suffer from flooding at that time. Especially 1948 was a really big flood year, and there's a note from the newspaper. It said recent record floods were occurring throughout BC, including on the Columbia River, which peaked at 22.49 feet. Farms in the Big Eddy were forced to evacuate, and 25 farmers at Mount Cartier were affected, many of them leaving their homes by raft. The farm crops at Sidmouth, 24 miles south, were completely ruined. The road and rail traffic south of Revelstoke was suspended. West of Revelstoke, the road washed out at Clanwilliam, and bridges on the Big Bend Highway were in poor condition. Locals were being urged to donate to help those affected by the flooding. There had been previous floods, but I think the 1948 was a record flood year. So all of this land is now what we call the flats. It's the area that's the drawdown zone for the Hugh Keenley Side Dam. So anybody who was living in that area and farming in that area had to leave in the 1960s. Most of them either burned their buildings themselves or they were burned by the hydro clearing crews. And all that farming activity was at an end. People had to, there were a few families that had land above the high water mark and they were able to relocate there. But most people didn't. They were on the lower land and they were given what BC Hydro would give them. And most people felt that it wasn't a really fair price for what they were giving up, what they were losing. And then they had to have their buildings burned down and get rid of their animals and their equipment and find new places to live. A lot of people say, yeah, they weren't making a living on their farms. A lot of them. There were a few like commercial farms, but most of these were, as I say, subsistence plus. But it was a lifestyle that people had really embraced and appreciated, and it was a big loss. It was a cultural loss for the Ukrainian community. It was an agricultural loss, and it was a loss of a lifestyle. This is a photograph showing some of the settlers who gathered for a barn building in the 1920s, and so they would work in community to help each other build their barns and their houses. One of the families that lived there for quite a few years was the Guyek family. This is Danny Guyek working on his farm, and again, there's John Deere tractor. And they were one of the families that did have land above the high water mark, and they were still able to grow crops on some of the land, but not able to put buildings on it. So even after the land was flooded, they continued to grow hay on there. This was their original farmhouse, taken from an aerial view, probably about 1950 or so, and of course, that area where the original buildings were is part of the flooded flats now. One of the other big dairies in town was the Hillcrest Dairy, and that was on the Hillcrest Farm, which is where the Hillcrest Hotel is now, and in that area, in Johnson Heights and the Revelstoke campground area. That was all part of the Hillcrest Dairy, owned by the Campbell Farm. Daniel Campbell purchased the land in 1907, 51 acres, and built a homestead and barns, and had a small farm. And then in 1920, he and his sons, Leslie and Arthur, started the Hillcrest Dairy, and it continued to operate until 1956. We purchased other properties in the area as well, including Hayner's Ranch, properties of Smith, Adams, Swan Carlson, Mr. Garner, and Mayert and Marino, who were all early farmers in the region as well. So by 1954, they had 600 acres. In the 1930s and 40s, they added a new dairy and silo and a tool shop and chicken coop. But once the Trans-Canada Highway was built, it bisected the property, making it no longer feasible to run it as a dairy. And they sold the cattle and business. Earl Campbell, who had taken over the farm from his father, still continued to own property up there for quite a while, but most of it has been sold at this time. And as I said, there were quite a few other farmers in that area as well. One of the other dairies in town was Carlson's West End Dairy, and there were other smaller dairy operations in the town as well. There was even a creamery that opened in 1916 in what's now the Jim's Refrigeration Building at the corner of Victoria and 4th Street. It operated for several years and took the cream from the local dairies. There were quite a few farms farther south as well at Sidmouth and Hall's Landing, 12 Mile. This is the Hall family farm at Hall's Landing, and they established there in the 1890s, and they were really well operated commercial beef cattle farm for many years, and they had to cease operation when the dam was built as well, as did Harold Catherwood, who had a beef cattle business at near Sidmouth or Sproat, and there were a few other commercial farmers in the area as well, and they all had to cease operation at that time. Revelstoke had a Farmers Institute that was started in 1913. And even just before the Institute was started, there was enough interest in town that an agricultural hall was built and a poultry house were built in Columbia Park, which was the area where they had built a racetrack, and they would have the horse races out there, and the fall fairs every year. So they built the halls to accommodate all of the fall fairs every year. And the poultry barn is no longer there, but the agricultural hall is now the clubhouse for the Revelstoke Golf Club. But there was quite a bit of interest by the local farmers, so they formed an institute in, as I say, in 1913. And some of the people involved in the executive were some of the people that you've heard me mention: Henry Hay, Mr. Calder, Potra, the people who were involved in farming in the region. They had a Farmers' Day celebration in June of 1915, and they also advertised that they were going to lease a site at the northeast corner of 2nd and Connaught for a market stand. So there's a big celebration on June 14th. They had a parade and pony races and stock judging. The parade included a recently imported Clydesdale horse that was supplied by the provincial government to the Stock Breeders Association. A lot of the community groups and businesses put in floats. The Farmers Institute float was described as most ingenious. It displayed the 4 seasons on a farm, the painted farmhouse surrounded with trees and flower gardens, potatoes and strawberries and other crops, and apparently it made quite a sensation. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of that float. Was noted with the Farmers Institute that Frank McCarty, who had a ranch where he was growing, or he was raising cattle because he had a meat market in town, he'd brought in a threshing machine in 1915. It was a 10 horsepower gasoline engine with an 8 horsepower separator. He had 60 acres across the Illecillewaet River. In 1918, it was mentioned that the Revelstoke United Farmers and Farmers Institute organized a competition for children under the age of 18 to kill gophers. That the gophers were destroying crops at a time when increased production was needed as part of the war effort, and a lot of people were encouraged to grow war gardens at that time. So it said that any child who brought in gopher tails before the first day of June would be eligible for prizes. At the end of the contest, 7 boys had killed a total of 384 gophers. The winner was 7-year-old Arthur Carlson, who killed 91 gophers. In October of 1921, it was noted that there was a display of local produce at City Hall, including a box of strawberries that were picked on September 29th. Beautiful apples from the Hayner Ranch, plums from the Hugh Smythe Farm, cheese made by the Revelstoke Creamery, and carrots and apples from some of the farms south of town. I found this interesting note from 1939, and I haven't seen anything more about it, so I'm not sure whether this happened, but it mentioned that the Rural Occupational School, which is part of the Dominion Provincial Youth Training Program, will open in Revelstoke on February 27th, 1939, in a downtown location. The purpose of this school is to offer instruction in agriculture and homemaking and crafts to young people between the ages of 16 and 35. Classes were free, and the program was to run for 2 weeks and was being sponsored by the Farmers Institute. Revelstoke also had a poultry association as well, which was associated with the Farmers Institute. There were quite a few very passionate poultry breeders in town. One of them was Roy Smythe, who had his tobacco store just across the street from the museum, the building that's just been restored. And he had a poultry run there. We just recently acquired this photograph, and it's got to be one of my favorite photographs. I think it's great. This barred Plymouth Rock chicken proudly overseeing his prize trophies there. So Roy Smythe and others, Fred Fleedham was another poultry breeder. There were quite a few in town, and they're very proud of their chickens. This is a letterhead that came from the Smythes, from Roy Smythe, and the Smythe's Plymouth Rocks, and mentioned all the prizes that his poultry has won, and saying that he's got the poultry for sale as well as eggs for sale. In 1939, this association called the Swine Improvement Association did a survey of local farmers, and they asked farmers for information on their crop and animals, and especially on information on expanding swine herds. They wanted to know what people had in the way of swine, whether they wanted to expand their herds, if they needed breeding animals. So there were 30 farmers that were surveyed, and we have all of these reports from these 30 farmers. And they also asked them how many acres they own and how many acres are under crop. So between those 30 farmers in 1939, they owned 1,335 acres of land and had 530 acres under crop. They collectively owned 101 swine, both boars and sows, 123 dairy cattle, 6 beef cattle, and 52 horses. And you can see on this form, it also has their yield. So it has oats, looks like 1/2 ton, barley none, wheat 1/2 ton, hay 10, roots 3 ton. So people were growing, oats, barley, wheat, hay, and root vegetables. Nobody put down corn, which I was surprised by, but they weren't I guess not any local corn crops at the time. But this is a really good opportunity to go through these forums and see the extent of farming in the area. We also have the membership lists for the Farmers Association around 1950. There were 76 farmers who were members of the association at that time at Big Eddy, Columbia Park, South Revelstoke, Mount Cartier, 12 Mile, Sidmouth, and Wigwam. Also in 1940, there was a club known as the Big Eddy Potato Club, and it was organized by Henry Popplewell, who was the head of the Farmers Association at that time. said they'd had a successful year. The plots were recently examined by Inspector Tuzo of the Provincial Department of Agriculture, who was highly pleased with the work of the young members. This was sort of young farmers who were members of the Potato Club. And it said A.S. Parker had a plot of Chippewa potatoes, which was a fine, smooth potato of convenient size. And in January 1941, there was a note in the newspaper saying that Arthur Parker and his 11-year-old daughter, Muriel Parker, were visitors at the Rotary Club. Muriel Parker was Muriel Gallicano, and said that she had been the winner of the highest honor at the Winter Seed Show at Vancouver the previous fall. She'd won for her entry of 12 seed potatoes, taking first place in a field of 56 contestants. So she talked to the Rotary Club at the age of 11 about growing potatoes. And then her father also spoke and addressed the Rotary meeting and spoke of the importance of introducing children and teenagers to agricultural work. In 1943, Henry Popplewell of the Farmers Institute said that 77 tons of vegetables had been supplied from farms in this district for the Japanese road camps that were in place between Revelstoke and Sicamous. Most of the vegetables had been grown by women and children. After the Griffiths farm, the local agricultural the experimental farm moved to Rolly Holt's farm at Mount Cartier, and they had a big crowd there for their annual field day in 1947. Said agricultural experts discussed matters of interest, and Mr. Holt's farm, located in the valley alongside the Columbia River between towering snow-clad peaks, provided an attractive place for the annual event. So after into the 50s and 60s, there was a bit of a decline in farming. More of the area close to Revelstoke was being developed for housing. There was a little less interest in farming. And of course, the flooding of the flats really took away a lot of the available farmland in the region, and really created a gap in available land and ability to have sustained agriculture in this area. And this is the part where I'd usually end this talk. But I was aware that it's not all a sad story anymore. There's a lot of recent developments in new farmers who've come into town and are starting agriculture. It might not be on the same level as what was here before. To say the land isn't there to have that level, but there's some really exciting things happening with farming in Revelstoke. So I'm really excited to be able to talk about some of our current Revelstoke farms. One of them is Terra Firma Farms. They've been in operation for several years now and recently relocated to the Nellis Ranch south on Highway 23 South. They have a small-scale certified organic farm. It's run by Terra Park and Rob J. They specialize in garden transplant and heirloom vegetables. Their crops are grown using ecological and sustainable practices. They also raise certified organic laying hens and broiler chickens. They're participating in something called community-supported agriculture, which is a cooperative structure between the local farm and the community. So CSA shareholders make a commitment to support the farm financially at the start of the season, and then they're provided with vegetables in exchange. So it's a really neat way for people to participate in the farm operation. Terra Firma Farms has just recently opened a restaurant called Terra Firma Kitchen, which is a farm-to-table restaurant. So it's just a really great way for them to continue to share their produce with the town with ready-made food at their restaurant. So congratulations to them for what they've been achieving. The Bird Tree Urban Farms is a couple named Christina Metzloff and Greg Golovat. who had been coming to Revelstoke for quite a few years and relocated permanent here in 2012. They have a heritage home in a double lot where they have a market garden on Railway Avenue. So that's right in that Little Italy area where there used to be little Italian families who would have small scale farms. They have vegetables and especially tomatoes, and they really specialize in flowers. They have really beautiful flowers, including dahlias, which is one of their specialty crops. They even offer flower subscriptions. You can get fresh flowers delivered to your doorstep, which is a great idea. And they also cater to weddings for flowers as well. So congratulations to them as well for what they're bringing to the farm community in Revelstoke. Sunnyside Farm is just down the street from me, and I didn't know this existed until last year. They're on Moss Street. They have a 1 acre property, Sunnyside Farm Garden and Landscapes. It was started in 2014 by Loris Colangelo, and it's a small urban farm that's really highly productive and uses agricultural techniques based on the principles found in permaculture and regenerative agriculture. Their products include microgreens, seasonal veggie starts, hanging baskets, annual planters, annual and perennial flowers, trees, shrubs, fertilizer, soil supplies, and specialized landscaping services. They've been a wholesaler of garden and landscaping goods to local grocery stores, including Southside Foods, hotels, businesses, landscapers, and landscape designers. And now they've expanded their website and they're selling more broadly to the general public as of this year. Beautiful flowers. And congratulations to them too. First Light Farm is a new farm just started last year with Jesse Johnston Hill and Chris Rubens. They've both lived here for over 10 years and really wanted to get into the agricultural scene in the region and wanted to do it in Revelstoke. They thought it was a really good opportunity to establish long-term sales here. They started last year on leased land within the ALR south of the airport on 2 plots. This year they've got 1 plot down there, but they also purchased a parcel of land within the city limits in the Big Eddy. They're growing mixed vegetables and they specialize in baby mustard greens, but they also grow a diversity of vegetables, including root crops. Congratulations to them for starting out and for expanding. I can't wait till it's garden season and we can see all the produce from these farms at the local markets. Track Street growers have been really successful the last few years. They're perched on the CPR Hill, just footsteps away from the downtown core. And it's this thriving urban farm known as Track Street Growers, operated by Sarah Harper and Stu Smith. They started as a way to provide fresh produce for the summer farmers markets and transformed into cultivating specific ingredients designed for their line of specialty hot sauces called Stoke the Fire. They do hot sauces, syrups, and seasonings. They specialize in garlic, exotic hot peppers with over 40 varieties of hot peppers, as well as honey and fresh seasonal produce. They focus on value-added agriculture. They began Revelstoke's first garlic festival several years ago, highlighting local farmers, growers, producers, chefs, and musicians. And anyone who's attended knows what a vibrant community event it is. And it'd be great if it can continue this year. So congratulations to Stu and Sarah for the great work that they're doing as well. And anybody who likes hot sauce, I know is going to enjoy their products. This is a farm I didn't know about until yesterday. I put a call out on the Revelstoke Growing Community Facebook page asking for information on local farms and discovered that there's a sheep farm on Cartier Road south of Revelstoke. They began in August of 2019 with their first flock of 12 ewes and 1 ram. It's run by Paula Van Viersen and her partner. Over the last 2 seasons, they have increased their flock and are now up to 40, with more lambs on the way. They're raising the sheep mostly for meat, but they also process and dye some of the wool for felting projects and spinning. Some ram lambs and ewe lambs will be sold to other farms for breeding, and some will be available for meat sales. So I was really surprised to see this, and congratulate them as well on starting this new farm business on Cartier Road. And Greenslide Cattle Company has been in operation since the mid-90s by Jim and Adele Graham. The Grahams had been farmers in that area for a long, long time, for at least a couple of generations. And so they were continuing on with a family tradition, or revitalizing a family tradition. And this is a photograph showing them ferrying their cows across the river for pasture in the spring a few years ago. And they supply beef to local businesses. So again, congratulations to them. So I'm really happy that I was able to conclude this talk with some really good news, and you see what's happening in agriculture in this region now. It's not a dead story. You know, it's something that's continuing and thriving and growing as we speak. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again at our next Brown Bag History. Thank you. Bye-bye.